Hello friends and welcome back to PG Prototypes. I'm Phil, and on last week's video I finished wiring all the servos up and I built a switch panel to house the DCC command station and the toggle switches. The day after I released last week's video, I decided to test the layout out on my dining room table. Running the layout in the workshop is easy as there's a lot of space, so I felt I needed to test moving the layout to the dining room and testing it in a more restricted space. It amazed me that there were issues that I would never have foreseen in the workshop. The first issue that I came across was the awkwardness I encountered when carrying the layout. Nothing major, but I definitely need to incorporate handles into this design. The next issue that I noticed was the wiring being exposed when carrying the layout from the workshop to the house. Again, nothing major, but I definitely want to have a semi-closed underside at the very least. So other than these issues, the layout ran great. I ran some locos for a good hour. The layout ran smoothly and it's really easy to operate while sitting at the dining room table. So with all that clarified, let's move on to today's episode. In part 4, I'm going to start planning the scenery and I'm going to build the first building of a larger factory complex. I'll show you how I loosely plan the building locations on the layout, and then I'll move on to actually creating a building from scratch, painting it and detailing it. Although I had a rough idea of what I wanted to do, I hadn't actually planned out any buildings. Now, this method is definitely not everyone's cup of tea, but I really love organic layout building, and this is what gives me the most enjoyment, and that is the most important thing. The limitations I set out in the track plan will dictate what type of building I can put where. So in other words, the function of the layout will dictate the form of the layout. Before I draw anything out or make any notes, I like to just look at the layout for as much time as I possibly can. I look at different angles. I imagine how it would look with different buildings in different places. I take photos. I like to use existing buildings to help me visualize the scale of the layout. I use any prop that I can to give me an idea of what the final product might look like. Here you can see what the layout would look like if relief buildings made up the backdrop. This is very similar to my last layout, the OO Harbour layout. Especially because I used the exact same buildings. But this was just to get the creative juices flowing and give me a starting point to work with. After some discussion with Hilton from Proper Chuffed, I decided I would not go for this exact style of backdrop, and I'd rather break it up a little bit more and not have a solid building backdrop. One building I did decide to use on this layout is a depot building from my current shelf layout. I like the look of it and I felt it would fit in with an idea that I had brewing in my mind. As you can see, I haven't completed the building yet, but enough of it is there to get an idea of what the final product will look like. At this point, I feel it's necessary to give a quick disclaimer. You'll see that I have a particular building and painting style. My buildings are not super realistic, and I really like to keep a bit of a toy element to them. This is the magic of model railroading for me, and it takes me back to my childhood sitting at a very popular train shop here in Johannesburg and just enjoying the hobby for what it was, for these beautiful models and scenes. Enough detail to be interesting, but still a toy that captures your imagination. I don't aim to impress rivet counters at all, and I just want for myself and visitors to be drawn into the mini world that I brewed up in my imagination. With a rough idea of the direction I was going to go in, I started marking out spaces that I had available for buildings along each siding. I wanted to have some relief buildings that weren't too high, and I felt that this side of the layout would be made up of interconnected buildings that made up a larger industry. The two building spaces that I marked out here would be a manufacturing section connected to the existing depot via a bridge of some sort, and a boiler house to the right complete with a smokestack and some form of coal store. I personally like this approach to building planning because it helps me to visualize how the various components will fit together. I like having an aerial view with some dark lines in place, and it helps me see how things will fit together once they're in place. I can also test the measurements out without having to scratch build anything. And when I do start designing the buildings, I can see how they'll fit in these spaces. Another great thing about marking a plan out on the baseboard is that I can put details like roads, paving, and ground cover down. I draw arrows to help me see the flow of the layout, and this is a great way to tell if the layout plan actually makes logical sense. I'm a very visual person, and I find this to be the best way to bridge conceptual thought to practical application. If you haven't tried this method, I highly recommend it. I taught GCSE and A-level design and technology for a few years, and I used to encourage my students to go through this type of process regardless of what they were designing or building. A formal plan isn't necessary at the start of a project. I personally feel that we should let our minds wander a bit. Document this wandering process and then choose components from that we can incorporate into a final design. There's nothing wrong with doing it this way. After about an hour of marking out building locations and deciding on how the layout could work, I decided that I'd split the layout into a front section with some grass section and ballasted track, and a back section which will be mostly paved and walled off with a few buildings. I don't want to overcrowd the layout, so I kept it very simple. At this point, I would like to emphasize that nothing is set in stone. If an idea doesn't work for me later on, I'm just going to change it accordingly. Sometimes we can only make decisions when we see more of the bigger picture. The next step was to trace the exact size of the boiler building in this location, scan it, import it into my drawing software, and scale it to start planning the building. Halfway through this exercise, I saw the layout from a bit of a different angle, and I decided to change my approach. This factory would still be made up of multiple buildings, but they would be full buildings, not half relief buildings. I decided I would cap the height to 3 stories. This would make the industry look smaller, and the shorter sidings would make more sense. It's also going to provide some really nice viewing angles from any side of the layout, rather than seeing the back of a backdrop. I drew out the plan I had sketched on the baseboard, and this would give me an exact measurement for drawing up my buildings. For today's video, I'm going to focus on the first building of this factory cluster. Over the years, I've built quite a few buildings, and rather than recalculate window sizes, door sizes, and heights, I prefer to go back to old drawings and just copy and paste the components that I know worked for me in the past. I'm using the depot building as a donor model for the boiler building that I'm making in today's video. I did some image searches on Google for British industrial buildings from the 1900s, and I like the look of a peaked parapet wall with some type of brick detail below it, and then arched windows, nice big front arched windows. So I designed my building around this concept. Now, I wasn't completely certain on what type of industry this was going to be. I narrowed it down to a brewery or a paper manufacturer. I'm not certain about this right now, so I'm just going to carry on building it as some form of production-based building, and for now I'll just call it the widget factory. With the design complete, I loaded the laser cutter with some 3mm MDF and started the process of engraving the details and cutting out the components needed to build my widget factory. Laser cut kits have become very common, and they are an affordable way for anyone to populate their layouts. There are some amazing kits out there, and as you will see, mine are definitely on the simpler side of the complexity spectrum. My models won't appeal to everyone, but they do the job just fine for my purposes. They're a bit simple to build, and there's enough detail to keep me happy. There's always the option of making them more complex, for example, opening windows, opening doors, interior details, but I am very happy with them just being a simple building that looks good on a running layout. A tricky thing to hide is the 3mm edge where 2 components join together. For this building, I've used cornerstones to disguise that joint. You'll see the concept of layering that I spoke about in the last video coming into play here again. By using multiple layers, I'm able to create depth on the otherwise flat facades, making the building that little bit more interesting. And after some careful alignment and gluing, here is what the complete assembly looks like. After priming the building with some light brown spray paint, it's time to accentuate the grout lines. For me, this is a crucial step in achieving the painting style that I like. Some people like to do this with a diluted wash, but I prefer to apply the undiluted white acrylic paint directly to the model. This technique also acts as a filler where there are some above average size spaces between joints. After applying a thick coat of paint with a brush, I use my finger or a dry cloth to wipe off any excess paint. And what's left is an accentuated grout line and a bit of a texture on the surface of the bricks too. This texture will be accentuated in the next step. Make no mistake, this is a painstaking process and there are times where it just becomes irritating getting this technique right. But if you're willing to stick it through, you will see that the results are really great. Here's what the building looks like after all the grout lines have been detailed. If you like clean, pristine buildings, this method is definitely not for you. As a child, I used to visit my grandfather's factory every week, and it was in an industrial area where all the buildings looked like they had weathered some serious storms. This is exactly where my interest lies, and I like making weathered working buildings. To achieve this, I'm going to dry brush some burnt sienna acrylic paint onto the bricks in random patches. And after this, I'm going to follow it up with some Hull Red acrylic to blend it all together with the base color. There are so many good tutorials on dry brushing online, so I'm just going to explain the gist of it here. I cover both sides of the tip of a brush with paint and I carefully paint off most of it onto a scrap piece of wood or a scrap piece of paper. It takes some practice to figure out how much paint needs to be left on the brush, but just be patient and keep experimenting until you get the effect that you like. After most of the paint has been removed, I carefully brush the bricks to pull out some of the raised detail. The excess white acrylic paint from the last step provides a raised edge to add texture to. So it's important to point out here that too much paint on the brush is going to lead to unrealistic streaking and harsh patches. But if you keep a wet rag with you when you do this type of painting, you can just gently wipe off any excess paint or you can blend it into the surrounding color. This kind of detailing is time consuming, but it's well worth it. It pays to be patient in these early steps as the detail is so worthwhile in my opinion. If you put a little more time in at this stage, you gain an impressive model for the rest of your layout's life. Here's what the building looks like after both colors have been dry brushed onto it. Now notice how the excess paint from the last step creates a washed and weathered effect. With the brickwork complete, I want to accentuate the cornerstones on the edges of the widget factory boiler. I went for a pebble color initially, but after seeing that it dried a little bit dark for my liking, I decided instead to go for a light gray to really make these details stand out. And here is how the final product turned out. Loads of texture, loads of weathering. This is exactly how I like an industrial building to look. I suppose one could argue that the colors are a little bit harsh, but for me this just takes me back to my childhood, roaming around that industrial area where my grandfather's factory was located. To me, this is how an industrial building looks in my imagination. In the past, I would just engrave the windowsills and keystones on the arched windows, but for this build, I decided to try a new technique. I cut the details out separately, painted them with grey primer spray paint, and then I carefully hammered them into place. I cut them to have a bit of a snug fit, so no glue is necessary for this step. It was a little tricky to get them in the right depth, but once they were in place, I really liked the final look. I've got to say that I'm really happy with how this technique worked. It adds a little more depth to the widget factory boiler house, and I'm definitely going to use this on the rest of the buildings in this layout series. I said it before and I'm going to say it again, layering is a wonderful technique to use on these projects. With the so-called wet works of the building complete, it was time to move on to installing the windows. I'm using XXX cardboard for my window frames, and I've cut the windows out as a group for each side. In the past, I used to cut out individual windows with separate sashes, but for this build, I'm just going to keep it very simple. That's all I require for the look that I'm going for this time around. I'm going for a red color scheme on this building, and I'm using a red acrylic paint to roughly paint the frames of the windows. I can afford to be a little bit messy here, as only the frame will be visible after I install the window sheet in the building. My windows need some glass, and for this I'm going to use some clear acetate sheet. I want my windows to be opaque, as I'm not going to be adding interior details at this point in time. So I used 320 grit water paper in a circular motion to rough up the acetate. A circular motion provides a more uniform finish, and after the acetate has been roughed up a bit, I give it a good coat of matte clear lacquer spray paint. Here is what it looks like when the process is complete. This sheet is a little bumpy as it was stashed away in the back of the drawer, but you'll see that it isn't really a big deal after it has been glued to the window frames. I glued my painted window frames to the acetate sheet, and I used a sharp hobby knife to cut around the edge of my frame sheet to remove the excess acetate. With this panel done, I moved on to the front arched windows, repeating the process, and then onto the other side panel. I used a watered down US flat brown to apply a wash to the engraved doors. I really like washes as they provide an easy method to get a realistic weathered look in one step. I cut some frames for my doors, gave them a quick black wash and glued them in place. Another small detail that emphasizes the magic of layering. The last part to be cut out and painted was the front door, and with this glued in place, all the openings were complete. Here is what the building looks like so far. All the components in place, the character of the building really starts to come to life. I'm so happy with the red color scheme, and the weathered look of the doors really brings an added level of character to the building. The final structural component of this build is the roof. I cut out a base that fitted snugly within the walls, and I added some triangular supports at equal spacing at the same angle as the parapet walls. I'm going for a sheet metal roof on this building, so I engraved some grooves into a sheet of XXX cardboard, and this gave me my final roof covering. A small piece of thin black cardboard was glued in place as a roof cap, and I gave the roof a test fit before moving on to painting. I gave the roof a good coat of grey spray paint primer, and I left it in the sun to dry for about 15 minutes. My roof needs to match the rest of the building, so it needs to be weathered, but nothing extreme. I start off by giving the roof a good wash with watered down black acrylic paint. Once the wash had been applied to the entire roof, I moved on to applying weathering powders. I'm a huge fan of the Vallejo products, and their weathering powders do not disappoint. For this application, I'm going to mix them with water and dab them on conservatively to create some spots of aging and interest. The colors I chose to use for this application were light yellow ochre, brown iron oxide, and natural umber. These were my three colors of choice to give a subtle weathered look. I'd like to point out again that I'm not an expert in this, but I'm going to do my best to explain my approach to this type of weathering. The first thing to note is that if we look at rust colors from dark to light, the dark colors generally represent earlier signs of wear, and the lighter colors appear later in the process. So if you go for lots of bright oranges, reds, and yellows, the piece that you're weathering is going to appear more rusted and more weathered than the more subtle colors. I'm going for a more subtle weathering, so I'm just going to apply small amounts of the watered down weathering powder to specific spots on the roof. It's important to remember that the color of the mix when applied is going to be different to the color of the dried mixture. The dried mixture will have a powdered look to it, and that gives you that sense of realism. I'm using the darkest color first, which in this case is the natural umber. I water it down a little bit, but if you want to create an actual rust texture, you can actually apply it as a thick paste. That doesn't work for me in this application though. Next, I apply some brown iron oxide. I'm going to add it around the edges of the previous layers just to highlight the edges a little. I'm going to use my finger to blend the two colors together, and you'll notice that I'm streaking the weathering powder downwards to create the impression of water erosion on the roof. The final layer of this weathering treatment is the yellow ochre, the lightest color. In this case, the roof is not very rusted, so I really want to be careful about how much I add. This one shows up really strong when it dries. You can always wipe away the excess with a wet cloth, but in this case I'm just gonna apply it very carefully from the start. With the building essentially complete, I wanted to add some details to add a little more realism. I designed some rainwater downpipes and printed them out on my 3D printer. I'm using an entry-level printer and printing with PLA. Nothing fancy here, but it does the job. If these details are something you'd like to print yourself, please drop me a message in the comments below and I'll gladly upload the model to Thingiverse for free. The tops of the walls were looking a little bare and incomplete, so I decided to cut out some flat sections just to cap it all off. I used XXX cardboard and painted it with grey primer spray paint. I felt this gave the building a nice finishing touch. Now, I don't want to go overboard on detailing this building, but I did feel that it needed a few small details just to complete it. With details like these, I like to take a handful of bits and pieces out of the laser cutter from leftover jobs. I choose pieces that look functional and I glue them to the building wherever they seem to fit. I then use thin metal wire to link components together. I'm not following any real application here. I just want to create the impression that the building has some real life components that contribute to its operation. And finally, let's take a look at the finished product. Today's video was my longest yet, and if you managed to stick out the entire video, I want to say a huge thank you. I love making these videos and I love sharing my passion for model trains. Thanks to everyone that has already liked, subscribed and shared my previous videos. There are not enough words to express my gratitude to you. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already liked and subscribed, please help me out and give that thumbs up button a click and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, thanks for watching and keep training.